Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, an ongoing conversation about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm your host, Eric Farnsworth. On one hand, democracy is holding up reasonably well across the region, with regular elections, a vibrant press, and human rights that are generally respected. But on the other hand, things aren't looking so good. There are now 3 police state dictatorships in the hemisphere: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, up from just 1 a few years ago, and others are exhibiting worrisome anti-democratic tendencies. At the end of July, Venezuelans went to the polls and overwhelmingly elected Edmundo Gonzalez, a result which the ruling Maduro regime refuses to recognize. The response has been fierce repression, for which the region has not been able to develop effective answers. It's a scenario we've seen before, namely in Nicaragua. Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo have ruled Nicaragua increasingly with an iron fist, seeking to co-opt, jail, or expel all who support a more democratic path. In 2021, Ortega simply stole elections by disqualifying opposition candidates and intimidating their supporters. One of those disqualified candidates was Felix Maradiaga, my guest today. Felix gained international attention during widespread protests against the Ortega regime in 2018. In June 2021, he was arbitrarily arrested and held in solitary confinement for 21 months, almost 2 years, after announcing his intention to contest the presidency. He was released in February 2023 and expelled to the United States along with 221 other political prisoners after the regime revoked their citizenship and confiscated their assets. Felix Maradiaga, thank you for joining us today at Democracy Dialogues.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for highlighting the situation of Nicaragua. Unfortunately, one of the strengths of the dictator is that he has been able to navigate under the radar for many, many years. So I truly appreciate you giving us time to explain what's happening in Nicaragua.
Well, it's our pleasure to have the opportunity to do so. And let me start our conversation by just where you teased it out. Look, a lot of us can talk about democracy across the region and we have our impressions about whether it's strong or weak, but you have lived some of the democratic experiences in Nicaragua and you have paid a cost. You've been a political prisoner, you've lost your citizenship, your assets. At a human level, tell us what it's like to be imprisoned by an autocratic regime.
I have been working for many years as a both human rights defender and as an academic on the issue of nonviolence. I opened a school for activists in Nicaragua, which was actually the first school of its nature in which we train people on nonviolence as a strategy for social change. This school was declared illegal by Ortega in 2022, and through that effort and through my prior work as Undersecretary of Defense for Veterans Affairs, I had been exposed to people who had suffered torture, the mutilation during war. Of course, I worked in many parts of the world as well as a guest speaker on these issues, but I should say that nothing prepared me for prison. I had the opportunity to speak to political prisoners for a number of countries through my collaboration with human rights networks. It's incredible that in 21st century we continue to have prisons in Nicaragua in such conditions. For example, in my case, I never had any access to reading or writing material as a person of faith, not having a Bible at any time, not being allowed to have any letters from my family, from my daughter, was particularly tough. I should say that I didn't spend the total 21 months in solitary confinement. Okay. I had large periods of time in solitary confinement. At some points, I was allowed to have another fellow political prisoner, but it's strange because we were not allowed to speak to each other. It's really hard to explain having a security camera in front of you 24/7 and a guard that is making sure that you could not speak even to your fellow human rights defender in prison.
Just a complete sense of isolation is what they were trying to achieve.
They were trying indeed to, I would say torture, that's the word, in ways that they will not leave any scars in the flesh, you know, and we can talk about a lot about where do you find resilience. But I'd like to use your question to highlight the fact that this is a situation that almost 1 million people suffered in 53 different countries. Not only in China, where hundreds of thousands of dissidents are imprisoned, but also very close to us, Cuba, Venezuela, even in Bolivia. So we are seeing that prison is being used as a political weapon by dictators who are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They're using these methods of repression. They're using financial repression for political control, so blocking bank accounts, expropriating assets. They're shutting down NGOs. And frankly speaking, what I call the democratic ecosystem is not responding with the same level of efficacy as these regimes are working together.
We're going to get to that in just a minute, but for those watching us who aren't familiar with your personal story, tell us a little bit what you were accused of doing and the absurdity of the charges against you.
I'll take a step back and speak very briefly about my background. So I was part of the generation of people who were forced into exile as a kid. So I was an unaccompanied minor as a kid. I lived with foster parents as my childhood. And then I went back to Nicaragua when Violeta Chamorro won the elections in 1990. The Sandinistas were defeated in free and fair elections for the first time in Nicaragua. I was a teenager when I came back, but I came back with a deep sense of empathy towards people who were politically persecuted. My mother had been persecuted by the Sandinistas in the 1980s, who had been confiscated. So as soon as I finished college, instead of pursuing a regular career, I became politically active. My dream was to create a school for pro-democracy activists, and many of my students played an important role in the protest. And Ortega basically argued that my career as a trainer in the field of nonviolence was particularly the work, quote unquote, of a foreign agent. So I was accused to be a foreign agent. I was sentenced to 13 years in prison.
Training of non-violent techniques.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Well.
Plus my academic work and my role as a activist, basically. This led to a detention that lasted 611 days. Prior to that, in 2018, I was accused of terrorism while I was giving my testimony at the UN Security Council and working with human rights organizations in Geneva, preparing a report. I was accused and my arrest warrant was issued in 2018, but I went back to Nicaragua eventually, despite the fact that I had an arrest warrant. But they did not put me into prison. I went back to Nicaragua. I think it was unexpected. They didn't think I was going to go back, but they placed me in this very strange regime in which I was not allowed to move beyond 11 kilometers around my house for 19 months.
Why 11 as opposed to 10 or 12?
I mean, this just shows you how ridiculous, outrageous these guys are. One day they would knock on my door because there were police officers in 3 different shifts all day. And they would knock on my door and say, "Oh, today you can move beyond 11 kilometers." It was completely absurd. On Mondays, I wanted to go to a religious service. I had no permission. And suddenly, on Tuesday, you can go to mass today,
It's very arbitrary.
It's arbitrary. And it shows that what they are designed, jumping into the core of your question, these regimes are designed to create a sense of persecution, of arbitrary detention, of lack of hope, because for them, the best solution is for pro-democracy activists and for dissidents to abandon the country.
Yep.
So that's what they're trying to do.
Yep.
They know that they cannot imprison millions of people, so they want to use you as a lesson for the rest of the population, but they want to force dissidents into exile. And that explains the reason why 15% of the population of Nicaragua has been forced into exile.
15%.
Yes.
It's an extraordinary number.
Yes.
It's extraordinary.
Since 2018. So just in Costa Rica, there are 800,000 Nicaraguans, taking into account those of the diaspora. But out of those 800,000, 244,000 are asylum seekers just in Costa Rica. And when you look into the demographics of this particular group, you see former city mayors, intellectuals, academics, journalists, student activists. Spain has a similar number. and of course the United States. So those three countries: Spain, Costa Rica, and the United States.
I mean, the arc of your activism, the arc of your vision for Nicaragua goes for many years. How do you sustain the hope, the energy, particularly when you're in isolation, in solitary confinement, your family, your assets are being separated from you forcibly? What is it that you find to give you your resilience, and how do people sustain that hope over time?
The short answer is that it's my faith in one hand, and the second important part, it's a complete and an utter commitment to the idea of democracy and freedom, not as something abstract, but something close to my heart. I'm the son of a political prisoner. My father was arrested. He was never a activist. He happened to be a student in Chile in 1972. So there was a regime change in Chile during the Pinochet coup d'etat, and my father was not involved in politics, but suddenly he became suspicious as a Nicaraguan who had been studying in Chile, and I saw the effect of repression on my father. He passed away when he was 32.
I'm sorry.
I was 8 years old, and then the Sandinistas, as I said, expropriated my mother. My mother really suffered a lot, mostly because of her faith. She was a devoted Catholic, a local leader of the Catholic community, and the Sandinistas targeted Catholics at a very early age. So at age 12, my mother made the most difficult decision a mother can make, and she said, I don't want you to be absorbing the propaganda of communists. I want you to leave the country. She had been in the U.S. During her years as a student. And she sent me to the United States. And I should say that in this country, I had my first exposure to what democracy looks like. I was welcomed into this country, received by foster parents. Eventually, I came here for college again and lived, imagine, in Alabama, in a very small town, very close to Mobile. And of course, years later, I went to Cambridge, Massachusetts to do graduate studies. So that gave me perspectives from different angles of the United States. They couldn't be as different one to the other. But these different exposures to American political culture, rural America in Alabama, and sophisticated Americans at Harvard, at Yale, they think they're different, but at the core, this is a country founded on ideas of democracy, freedom. They believe in the importance of controlling the state, because taxpayers should hold governments accountable. And this is such a powerful American idea that most Americans do not really realize how high standards these are for those of us who come from autocracy. So when I came back to Nicaragua, I think that I was already, in a way, sold in the idea. I drank the Kool-Aid of what democracy and freedom is. So I became really a freedom geek, I became a libertarian in college, I would say. And the fact that I saw then in my role as member of government, soldiers from the Contra that had been mutilated during the wars, former combatants of the Sandinistas, that when I interviewed them, they regretted fighting on the Sandinista side because they were victims. I realized that I didn't want my daughter to go through the same things I went. When I became a father, although this was an idea that was with me before, that democracy and freedom is not free. I mean, someone has to really work for their freedom. And Eric, as much as I love the US, my dream is Nicaragua. It's the country I love. And if we don't work for our countries, I mean, we do not will allow these countries, let it be, the case of Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua, to be in the hands of dictators. So I think that an act of patriotism is basically to tell these guys that we will not allow them to steal our freedom.
But it's a great message for the United States as well, particularly as we have our own elections upcoming. It's interesting that you're talking about this as an intergenerational project, your own parents, yourself, now your children. I mean, this is a really powerful motivating factor, and I think there's nothing that motivates us more than wanting our children to have a better life than ourselves. I mean, that is a really powerful thing. Tell us, what are some of the techniques that the regime uses to enforce their will, to break the spirit of democracy promoters? You talked about trying to push people into exile. What are some of the things that the regime does if they do it without using, well, sometimes they do use physical violence, for example, in the protests in 2018, but you also said there's more of a mental or an emotional battle that you have to fight.
Well, I would say that there are three broad categories of tactics. First of all, they used all tactics that tyrants have been using for millennia. Declaring people stateless is something that the Romans used to do, or torturing people. It was a practice in medieval times. So they used the whole menu of classical tactics, basically repression, fear, intimidation, going after your assets. I think that's, I would say, the category of classical tyrants. But on the other hand, dictators are becoming more sophisticated. So they're using tactics that are not so obvious. For example, they are working with chronic capitalists, and suddenly you saw Ortega working alongside important business conglomerates who are taking advantage, by the way, of a free trade agreement with the United States, as ridiculous as it sounds, and trying to co-opt businesses, trying to co-opt universities, trying to co-opt media, and forcing journalists to work for them. Either you sell your TV network, that's what we'll say, or take away or shut down media. So that's the second category. And third, it's transnational repression, which is working with other regimes to persecute the voices in exile. And this is a new trend that is becoming increasingly disturbing. Before, once as an activist you were in exile, dictators didn't have any capacity to persecute you. But now they're not only trying to impose the rules inside, let's say in this case Nicaragua, but they're trying to place the rules beyond their borders. So they are persecuting dissidents even outside their borders.
We're here with Felix Maradiaga talking about Nicaragua, some of his personal experiences, as well as the oppression that's happening both in Nicaragua and around the Western Hemisphere. Felix, what are some of those techniques? Look, I mean, this is a dictator's playbook that we've heard so much about. They're sharing techniques, they're sharing technology, they're sharing information warfare. These are some tools that didn't exist, certainly a generation ago, but even a few years ago. Give us a sense of how widespread this is. In other words, are Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua and Bolivia all sharing and reinforcing each other? Russia, China, or are these just happen to be going in the same direction and it's convenient for them? Or are they really coordinating their efforts? What's your sense about that?
There's no doubt they're coordinating themselves. However, I think that they learned a lot from the failed experience of the outrageous Soviet experiment. For example, as you may recall, the Soviets never said, this is communism against democracy. The argument was communism against imperialism, right? Because they acknowledged the soft power of democracy. So the ideas of communism were never cool, were never attractive. So I think that dictators reinvented themselves and became ideologically agnostic. In other words, you see, for example, nationalistic Putin collaborating with communist China, or with socialist Venezuela, or with the theocratic Tehran. They don't really care about their fundamental ideology. And that's a big difference of how they used to coordinate before. They have a common enemy. I think the US is their common enemy. And pro-democracy activists around the global south are perceived as agents of the US, which is a very powerful narrative, particularly in countries in which there is a love-hate relationship with the US against Europe because of the colonial experience of Europe in Africa. So I think that the key tactic in terms of coordination is trying to find a common enemy, and their common enemy is liberal democracy, is Western democracy. Their common enemy is the US. That's by far the most important level of coordination.
And is it to try to destroy the concept of liberal democracy abroad, or is it to keep themselves in power and to enrich themselves? Some combination. In other words, what I'm trying to get at, is this a tool that they're trying to use for other purposes, or is the purpose really to destroy or make more chaotic the global environment and conceptions of liberal democracy?
It's a directly proportional relationship, because they know that as the idea of liberal democracy becomes global, as the moral authority of the US is strong, then their own populations inside Russia, inside China, inside Nicaragua, inside Vietnam, looks at the success of liberal democracy in terms of free markets, in terms of the free press, in terms of innovation. So the best universities of the world are in free countries, particularly in the US. So they want the model to fail, because they want to argue that there is an alternative world order that has ideas around the strong men, ideas around being efficient in delivering roads and efficient in fighting COVID without any free press. So they're trying to really reinvent social reality, but arguing that democracy is non-functional. And I should say that the loss of relative influence of the US is not a domestic problem. It's a global problem, because whether some dear Americans like it or not, global democracy is directly related to the future of American influence as well. So that's why the US has become so central to the autocratic narrative.
So then, if you take those two strands together, which I completely concur with, what does that imply for the Western world or for the pro-democracy forces worldwide? In other words, how do we combat this this coordinated effort and these trends, which are really quite significant?
There are a number of things, but if I had to pick one in particular, it's building common cause. I mean, the autocracies, and Anna Applebaum uses this concept of autocracies Inc. They're agnostic, they collaborate among each other. They're often kleptocratic. However, pro-democracy ecosystems are unfortunately very polarized. So in my case, I will identify as a liberal, not in the American sense of what... Of what
traditional liberal.
Exactly. We have certain issues with our friends from the more social democrat part or with the conservatives. And that's not working very well. We have to recognize that there are core democratic values, and these core democratic values work very well for someone that might be more liberal, more conservative, or also you have the dimension of people who it's more connected to faith-based communities, vis-a-vis people who are less inclined to pursue religious ideas. However, autocracies, they go after religious freedom. They go after the rights of minorities. They go after the rights of the business sector. But we're not collaborating, because we have our own niche. If you are a free market person, you feel more comfortable with the business sector. If you are, let's say, a member of a minority in some part of the world, you might be inclined to collaborate with other groups that are not necessarily free markets. It's only an example. So what can we do? Build common cause. That's, I think, the most effective way. And this is a very old tactic. It's not nothing new. Dictators are using the old method of divide and conquer.
Yeah. Let's come back to Nicaragua in the few minutes that we have remaining in our session today. One of the things, you've raised it yourself several times, religious freedom, attacks on the faith community in Nicaragua, the Catholic Church in particular, the leadership, some of the laity, but also the evangelical community, the Jewish community in Nicaragua, which is not large, but nonetheless, the regime has targeted people of faith. What's behind that? What explains this brutal effort to vilify and to really attack people of faith?
No freedom is more intimate when building free speech than the freedom of faith. So the first free speech I think that we have is the freedom of thought. So I always talk, this is the freedom to believe or not to believe in something. And so that's I would say the most important element. It's just an attack of all freedoms, and it was only a matter of time that they were going to target faith-based organizations and religious institutions. They started with the Catholic Church, They're doing it with the Protestant community. They did it with the Jewish community in the 1980s by expelling over 200 Jewish families and shutting down the synagogue in Managua and expropriating and confiscating the assets of the Jewish community. Very small, but highly successful. So the Sandinistas has always seen organized religious communities as a problem for their ideas. But there's also another reason. The Catholic Church in particular had a great and impressive solidarity with students during the massacre of 2018. And social justice. And of course, the Sandinista regime sees the Catholic Church and its moral authority as a threat.
One of the things that I've found personally interesting about this whole episodes over the last several years is the fact that you have the first Latin American Pope in history, Francis, but it seems as if the Catholic Church just hasn't responded in a strong way to the attacks on its own interests within Nicaragua. And I'm not even talking about the broader democracy agenda. I'm talking about its own assets and interests in Nicaragua. It's just a curiosity to me.
Well, you're right. I think that as a Catholic myself, I would like to see His Holiness being more active on Nicaragua. The fact there is so much silence by religious leaders, though the very few that remained in Nicaragua, and let me give you the example of my own diocese, Maragalpa, more than 70% of the priests have been already expelled. So people in Nicaragua, in this particular diocese, don't even have some priests to run their parish. But when I talk to them, I think that the fact that there is silence speaks in itself.
No, I think that's a key point. And I think if the regime can keep people silent, they've won the battle because nobody is pushing back. Speaking of things that the international community can do, you referenced the fact that Nicaragua still enjoys free trade privileges with the United States. This is through the CAFTA-DR agreement that was grandfathered in since before the regime of Ortega Murillo. What would you do if you had a magic wand to address that situation?
I think it's unacceptable. I think that free trade, particularly with the largest economy of the world, is a privilege. I mean, we see robust democracies around the world that would love to have a free trade agreement with the U.S. So it should be a quid pro quo. If you want, as a country, to have the benefits of free trade, it's a quid pro quo. You should have also respect of labor rights, which Ortega abuses those labor rights as well. Respect of private property. Even American citizens have lost their properties in Nicaragua. I would shut down the agreement right away.
Yeah, it does seem to be a strange anomaly, particularly these days, to have those privileges extended to a totalitarian police state, when other countries, particularly in Latin America, but elsewhere around the world, don't have similar privileges with the United States.
Yes, yeah. It's a very strange situation. But a broader question beyond free trade agreements, it is clear that the institutions, the international institutions that we have today were built with the wind in our back, so to speak.
Yes.
You know, we had a new wave of democratization. According to Freedom House, we're into 17 consecutive years of democratic regression. And that infrastructure, both legal and institutional, is not really prepared to respond to these threats. So the OAS, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, they don't know how to deal with these regimes. And of course, the UN, with all due respect, as a former a consultant for the UN for many, many years, I should say that also they do not know how to respond. I mean, and if you think about having Russia, a member of the Security Council, having an illegal invasion in Ukraine, for example. So we're living a crazy world in which international institutions do not have the mechanisms to really target and stop authoritarianism.
This is, I'm afraid to say, because we're ending our conversation, but this is the key point.
It is.
And, you know, the institutions that we have today were created for a different time, a different place, when different tools were available or not available, but things have evolved and are being weaponized, literally, by authoritarian regimes to go against democratic governance and democratic actors in a very destructive way, and the international community simply has not kept up. That's a topic for another conversation. Felix Maradiaga, I hope you'll come back and talk to us in greater length with some of these issues. Fascinating conversation with you today.
And also let me take a minute just to thank you personally for the work you've done. I know that you are a very humble man. You will never say it publicly, but thank you for raising a voice and for your empathy to the cause of people who are suffering, not only in Nicaragua, but I've seen you so active with our friends in Venezuela. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that as well. It is a real pleasure. And to all of you, thank you for joining us again today for Democracy Dialogues. We hope you will watch us the first Thursday of every month when we come to you live and also via YouTube. You can see us on our website at www.as-coa.org. And until then, we ask that you would join together with us to make sure that democracy delivers for all of us.
Ready to be part of an elite business network shaping a more prosperous Western Hemisphere. Founded nearly 60 years ago by David Rockefeller, Council of the Americas can be your gateway to new markets, better relationships, and a deeper understanding of Latin America.
It's incredible, the agenda that you put together. It's really uncommon to see discussions about technology in which the CEOs of very large corporations are the ones presenting.
Very good insights, and most importantly, developing relationships and understanding how can we work together for the future of the region.
Through more than 160 private events and conferences in 8 countries last year alone, our members engage with government officials, CEOs, and top experts, building solutions to the most critical issues affecting the region. Whether meeting presidents and ministers in our New York, Washington, or Miami offices, joining exclusive and industry-focused missions to Latin American countries, or being part of CEO and CFO forums happening across the region, our community of more than 200 corporate members shapes substantive dialogue on topics such as artificial intelligence, healthcare, and sustainability in the Americas.
When you become an individual member of the Council of the Americas, you really have this access to people in the private sector, people in the public sector, in a way that would be very difficult to replicate elsewhere.
Share strategies at our symposium and Bravo leadership forums with hundreds of senior business and government leaders gathering in Miami. Learn about what's framing U.S. policy on trade, energy, and democracy in the region at the Washington Conference on the Americas. And get fresh insights on regional events from influential voices in America's Quarterly.
The richness of our content doesn't just come from a minister or a president sitting and talking to our members. It comes from listening to everyone at the table. What sets us apart is our ability to bring everyone together. You build new relationships face to face.
The Council is a constant in the sense that administrations and governments come and go, but the Council is always there.
This is an opportunity for companies and countries of Latin America to come together and engage. And engagement is the most important thing to understand one another.
Join us. We connect the Americas.